Now listen, you gotta understand the kind of cold that settles over an airbase in the middle of England, especially when the war is grinding on, and every single night feels like a coin toss between life and death. It wasn't just the dampness that got into your bones. It was the quiet dread, the knowledge that men were flying high above the clouds, depending on people like Sergeant Frank Miller, sitting in a glorified wooden shack near the runway. Frank Miller wasn't a pilot, wasn't a gunner, wasn't a bombardier aiming for the heart of the enemy. He was just a radio man, a signal corps specialist, tucked away in the direction-finding hut, or the DF hut as they called it. His world was made of static, green glowing screens, buzzing vacuum tubes, and the endless maddening Morse code tapping that sounded like rain on a tin roof. He was 24 years old, but the shadows under his eyes made him look 40. Tonight was one of those nights where the air felt thick, like soup. The fog had rolled in early from the North Sea, a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the runway lights completely. Visibility was 0, maybe less. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and that was bad news. Real bad news, because tonight, the 8th Air Force had sent out the largest formation of the month. A deep strike against industrial targets, the kind of mission that guaranteed heavy losses. Frank was sitting hunched over his receiver, a big, heavy piece of equipment called AO, the ANGRC-9, affectionately nicknamed the Angry 9. He had his headphones clamped tight, listening to the vast, empty sky. His job was simple. When those big birds, the B-17 flying fortresses, came limping home, battered, shot up and lost in the fog, Frank had to give them the precise bearing back to the runway. He was the voice, the compass, the lifeline. He checked the clock on the wall. 02:15 hours. They were due back any time now. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the generators and the occasional scratch of static. "How's the soup out there, Miller?" came a voice from the small speaker box on the desk, crackling with impatience. It was Lieutenant Davies, the graveyard shift supervisor, sitting warm and dry in the main tower, a mile away. "Thick as concrete, sir," Frank reported, his voice low and steady. He knew Davies hated the DF hut because it was isolated and smelled faintly of ozone and old coffee. "I can barely see the boundary fence. Marker." "Right. Keep that beacon strong, Sergeant. They're going to need it tonight. We got reports of heavy flak and fighter engagement over the target. Expect them to be scattered and running low on juice." "Understood, sir. Homing signal is running at peak power, standard frequency. Ready for traffic." Frank leaned back for a moment, rubbing his tired eyes. He thought about those guys up there, the young pilots, the navigators trying desperately to get a fix on anything through the clouds, the tail gunners freezing their butts off. He knew what it was like to be lost in the dark, relying on a faint whisper of a radio signal. If his gear failed, or if the transmission wavered, those boys were done. They'd run out of fuel and drop out of the sky into the muddy English countryside, or worse, into the icy sea. 23 bombers were out there. That meant over 200 men, all depending on that steady, reliable hum he was sending out into the void. The minutes dragged like hours. Then, the static changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was organized chaos. Scratch, hiss, tap, 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 hiss. Frank grabbed the microphone, his adrenaline surging. He knew the difference between random interference and real distress traffic. "Ground control, this is Bandit 4 Nero," a strained voice cut through, thick with wind noise and fear. "Requesting immediate bearing. We are completely blind. Navigational aids offline. Fuel critical." "Bandit 4 Nero, this is Homer 7. Hold your position. I am reading your signal now. Give me a moment to lock your bearing," Frank responded immediately, his fingers flying over the dials of the DF equipment. He watched the green line on the screen wobble, trying to fix the direction of the incoming signal. The fog and the sheer distance were playing havoc with the reception. The signal kept fading, jumping, and then reappearing weakly. "Bandit 4 Nero, your bearing is 305 degrees. Magnetic. Repeat, 305. Maintain altitude and listen for the beacon tone. 305 received, Homer 7. We are turning now. Thanks, God. Thanks. The relief in the pilot's voice was palpable, even through the static. Frank managed to guide the first few stragglers in. They were single planes, damaged, sneaking in one by one. But then the real trouble started. It wasn't just one or two planes. The entire formation seemed to have hit a wall of weather they hadn't anticipated, scattering them far wider than normal. Suddenly the airwaves exploded. Bandit 5 and 9 reporting lost. Where is the field? We are icing up. Bandit 2-1, we are circling. Fuel lights blinking. We need a vector now. Homer 7, this is the whole damn mess. We can't see anything. Interference is terrible. Frank was sweating despite the cold in the shack. He was trying to track half a dozen signals simultaneously, spinning the dials, his ears straining to pick out the distinct whine of each aircraft's transmitter. He was sending out the general homing signal, a powerful pulse designed to be picked up miles away, but the pilots were complaining. Homer 7, your signal is faint. Are you running low power? Demanded the pilot of Bandit 1-1, sounding desperate. Negative, Bandit 1-1, I am running peak power, Frank insisted. He knew the problem wasn't his power output. The problem was the weather, the sheer distance, and the fact that his station, the DF hut, was running on slightly older equipment compared to the massive, brand-new gear at the main tower. His signal was technically strong, but the atmospheric conditions were degrading it terribly. And this is where the bureaucracy of war started to rear its ugly head. The main tower was getting the same panicked reports. They were supposed to be the primary guidance system, but they were overwhelmed. Lieutenant Davies, already stressed, patched in a direct line to Frank's shack. Miller, what in the devil is going on down there? The pilots are reporting your homing beacon is weak. Weak, Sergeant. Are you sure your amplifier tubes are holding up? Davies's voice was tight, high-pitched with frustration. Frank felt a familiar wave of annoyance. They always blamed the equipment in the hut. Sir, my equipment is operating within parameters. The output is reading 100%. It's the interference, Lieutenant. The atmospheric skip is terrible, and the fog is dense enough to cut with a knife. It's eating the signal. I don't care about the physics, Miller. I care about the results. Captain Hayes is up here, and he's seeing the telemetry reports on your signal strength. He says your broadcast integrity is marginal. Marginal, Miller. That's not good enough for 23 aircraft. Captain Hayes. Now that was trouble. Hayes was the kind of officer who lived by the rule book and the data sheet. He trusted the numbers on the gauge more than the sweat on a man's brow. A few seconds later, Captain Hayes himself took the line, his voice cold and deliberate, cutting through the static noise of the DF hut. Sergeant Miller, this is Captain Hayes. I am looking at the telemetry data. Your broadcast signal strength at the expected recovery radius is dangerously low. It is fluctuating below the minimum threshold established for safe mass guidance. Frank gripped the edge of his desk. He could feel the pressure mounting. Captain, with all respect, I am reading the pilots. They are picking up the signal, sir. It's faint, but they're following the bearing. Faint is unacceptable, Miller. We have 23 crews depending on stable guidance. We cannot afford ambiguity. If your signal is too weak, they will miss the turn, overshoot the field, and end up in the sea. This is a critical situation. I am ordering you to increase power or cease transmission immediately so we can switch to the backup frequency from the main tower. Frank felt his stomach drop. Cease transmission? The main tower's backup frequency was notoriously slow to activate, and they needed immediate guidance. Plus, the main tower's transmitters, while powerful, were omnidirectional and didn't offer the precise bearing that Frank's specialized DF equipment could provide. The pilots needed direction, not just a loud noise. Captain, switching frequencies now will cause mass confusion. We have Bandit 4 Nero on final approach based on my current bearing, and I have 10 more planes requesting immediate guidance. The main tower can't give them the precise angle they need in this fog. Hayes's voice hardened. Your opinion is noted, Sergeant. Your signal is too weak to be reliable, according to the metrics. You are running a massive risk of misguiding these planes. I need you to confirm your ability to boost the signal now. Frank looked at his console. The output needle was pegged at 100%. There was no more power to give. His equipment was already maxed out. He had pushed this old machine to the very limit of its operational capacity. He took a deep breath, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. Captain, I cannot boost the signal further. I am at maximum output. There was a long, terrifying silence on the line from the tower. Frank could hear the frantic chatter of the main control room in the background, the sound of organized fear. Then your equipment is inadequate, Sergeant. You are creating a hazard. Effective immediately, you are to maintain minimum power solely for emergency location of downed aircraft. All primary guidance will shift to the main tower frequency. Confirm receipt of order. Hayes's voice was final, authoritative, and terrifyingly detached. Frank stared at the microphone. He had just been ordered to stop doing the one thing that could save those men. He knew deep in his gut that the main tower's broadband signal wouldn't cut it. Not in this fog, not with this many lost planes. They needed precision. They needed his bearings. He had 23 crews out, there, lost, scared, and trusting the faint signal they were currently receiving. If he cut the power now, even for a moment, they would lose that lifeline entirely. They would drift into the darkness. Captain, Frank began, his voice barely a whisper. I confirm the order to reduce power and shift guidance to the main tower frequency. He confirmed the order. That was what he had to do. But as he reached for the power dial, his hand hesitated. He looked at the glowing green screen again, where the signals of the lost bombers were dancing faintly. He could hear their calls in his headset, muffled, desperate cries for help. Homer 7, where are you? We lost the tone. We lost the tone. Bandit 5-9 is spiraling. Fuel pressure dropping fast. Frank pulled his hand back from the dial. He closed his eyes for a brief second, calculating the risk. If he obeyed the order, those men might die, lost in the confusing noise of the main tower's signal. If he disobeyed, he risked court-martial, but he might save them. He had to make a choice between following the book and saving 200 lives. He looked at the console again. His signal was weak, yes, too weak for the captain's precious data sheet. But it was consistent. It was giving them a bearing. It was giving them hope. He decided then and there. He wouldn't cut the power. He wouldn't reduce the signal. But he couldn't openly defy Captain Hayes either. He grabbed the microphone, switching his transmission, back to the pilots, ignoring the direct line from the tower, which was now buzzing with static and the sound of Hayes shouting his name. Attention, all Bandit aircraft currently receiving Homer 7. Frank broadcast, his voice urgent but controlled. Listen carefully. Due to atmospheric conditions, the signal strength is low. I repeat, the signal strength is low, but the bearing is accurate. Do not deviate. Follow the signal until you hear the approach beacon. You must trust the bearing. He focused all his attention back on the green scope. He saw the cluster of signals moving wildly. They were panicking, trying to find the stronger but less precise signal from the main tower. But the fog was swallowing everything. They were truly blind. Frank knew he had to become their eyes, their single unwavering point of reference. He had to use the weakness of his signal, the very thing command had condemned, as his strength. Because while the signal was faint, it was theirs. It belonged to his small forgotten DF hut. He started working the dials with a focused intensity he hadn't known he possessed. He wasn't just sending out a beacon anymore. He was talking directly to the sky, pulling them in one by one, using every trick he knew to filter out the noise and stabilize the faint readings. Bandit 2-1, I have you. You are drifting left. Correct heading to 280 degrees. Follow the faint tone. Trust the tone. Bandit 5-9, you are still too far north. Turn. South heading 190. Your signal is incredibly weak, but I see you. Keep coming. He was now operating in direct violation of a superior officer's order, betting everything on the idea that a weak, reliable signal was better than a strong, confusing one. The tower phone was ringing off the hook, the red light flashing angrily, but Frank ignored it completely. He had 200 men flying on faith, and he was their only anchor. He had to dedicate every fiber of his being to keeping that 2-week signal alive and stable, transforming a technical deficiency into a navigational miracle. The night was young, and 23 planes were still lost in the blinding fog, depending entirely on the steady, dedicated hands of Sergeant Frank Miller. The crisis had just begun, and the odds were stacked against his little shack and his old equipment. He just had to make that faint whisper loud enough to guide them home. He confirmed the order, but his hands weren't moving towards the power switch. They were moving towards the phone line connecting him to the main tower. The red light on the box was pulsating like a frantic, angry heart, and the sound coming from the speaker, Hayes's voice, sharp and demanding, was pure poison to the intense concentration Frank needed. He couldn't work with that noise in his ear. Frank snatched the patch cord connecting the tower line and yanked it out of the wall jack with a decisive, violent pull. Silence. It wasn't a relaxing silence. It was the heavy, dangerous silence of a man who has just burned his bridges. He was now officially offline from command, isolated in his little shack, betting his career and maybe his freedom on his ability to save those men. "All right, boys," Frank muttered to the empty room, pulling the headphones back down tight over his ears. "It's just you and me now." He ignored the buzzing of the disconnected line and focused entirely on the ethereal whispers coming through the static. He knew Hayes was right about one thing. The signal was weak. But Frank also knew something Hayes, sitting up in his warm tower reading telemetry, didn't understand. The signal wasn't just data, it was a conversation. The old ANGRC-9 wasn't the newest machine, but Frank had nursed it for years. He knew its hums, its skips, and its blind spots. He knew that when the green line on the scope wobbled, it wasn't just atmospheric interference. It was the sound of a B-17 struggling to hold altitude. It's generator straining. He started using a trick he'd developed during long, boring training exercises, a trick that would have made Captain Hayes have an aneurysm. Instead of relying purely on the electronic phase detection to fix the bearing, Frank was using the human ear. When a radio signal is weak and fading, the automatic filters try to smooth it out, often losing the precise center of the transmission. Frank bypassed some of those filters. He was listening for the subtle shift in pitch and volume of the Morse code tap, the slight distortion that told him the plane was moving relative to his antenna array. It was like hunting in the dark, not by sight, but by echo. "Bandit 4 Nero, you are doing fine. Just a little further," Frank whispered into the mic, his voice calm and steady, fighting the urge to shout. He watched the scope. Bandit 4 Nero's signal was barely a flicker, but it was centered perfectly on 295 degrees. "Homer 7, we are running on fumes. Can you confirm distance?" The pilot's voice was ragged. Frank couldn't confirm distance accurately in this weather, not without risking a deadly delay. He had to give them a target they could reach now. "Bandit 4 Neo, maintain current heading. Your bearing is solid. Look for the lights. They should be visible very soon. You are almost over the boundary." He held his breath. If he was wrong, Ford and Neo would drop out of the sky before hitting the runway. If he was right, they were minutes from safety. The tense silence was broken by a sudden tearing roar, muffled by the fog but unmistakable. The sound of 4 massive engines straining against the heavy air, passing almost directly overhead. Vroom. Frank jumped, slamming his hand on the desk. That was close. Too close. They were low. A split second later, the pilot of Ford Aereo screamed, "Homer 7, we see the green. We see the runway lights. God bless you. Landing now." Frank slumped against the chair, a wave of pure physical exhaustion washing over him. 1 down, 22 to go. The success of Bandit 4 Nero was the proof of concept. The faint signal worked, provided the pilot trusted the man on the ground more than his own fear. He immediately turned his attention to the next desperate voice. "Bandit 2-1, I have you now. Swing hard right, heading 300. You're coming in too flat. Get some altitude, son, before you hit the trees. Frank guided Bandit 2-1 and then Bandit 5-9 in rapid succession. The process was agonizingly slow, requiring constant micro-adjustments to the bearing. He had to talk them down like a father talking a child through a nightmare, never letting his voice waver, even when the signals dipped so low he thought he'd lost them forever. He was using the small localized power of his DF hut like a surgical laser, cutting through the general noise being broadcast, ineffectively, by the main tower. In the span of 30 minutes, Frank guided 6 planes safely onto the tarmac. 6 planes, over 60 men. Each successful landing was a spike of adrenaline, followed by the immediate return to the cold, focused reality of the remaining list. He checked his mental tally. 17 planes left. And that's when the night decided to get personal. The atmospheric conditions, which had been terrible, now became catastrophic. A massive moisture-laden air mass shifted position, and the resulting electrical interference spiked violently. The airwaves were suddenly choked with white noise, a searing static that drowned out the faint, crucial signals. On the scope, the remaining 17 dancing green lines vanished. Just gone. Frank leaned forward, frantically turning the gain dial, trying to pull the signals back from the void. Nothing but the shriek of static. Bandit traffic, this is Homer 7. Report your status, report your status. Frank yelled into the microphone. Only silence answered. The silence was worse than the panicked chatter. It meant they were either too far away or the interference was so dense they couldn't hear him, or worse, they had run out of fuel and were already spiraling down. He knew this was the moment Hayes had feared, the moment the marginal signal failed completely. But Hayes hadn't factored in the sheer desperation of a man who had already committed treason to save lives. Frank started experimenting wildly. He shifted the frequency a few kilocycles higher than standard. This was strictly against protocol. The pilots wouldn't be listening. There. But Frank wasn't looking for the pilots. He was looking for the ghost of their transmission, the bleed-over signal that might be slightly cleaner on an adjacent band. He spun the dial, his ear pressed tight against the headphone cup. Scratch. Hiss. Then, a fleeting, almost imperceptible pattern emerged, buried deep within the noise. It wasn't the clear Morse code of the homing beacon. It was the secondary, weaker signal used for short-range communication, leaking through. It was Bandit 8-8. The pilot wasn't calling for him. He was talking to another plane in his formation, a desperate confirmation that they were still together. 88 to 89, I think we are turning west. Do you have any fix? Anything? The voice was shaky. They were lost and moving away from the field. Frank locked onto that faint secondary signal, pulling the bearing line across the scope. It was a messy, imprecise reading, but it was the only thing he had. He had to get them back, to the main frequency. He switched back to the primary band and broadcast, raising his voice, pouring all the power he had into the transmission. Bandit 8-8, this is Homer 7. I see you. You are heading wrong. Turn east immediately. Heading 090, I repeat 090, you must confirm bearing. Silence. The interference was too thick. They couldn't hear him. Frank felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had their bearing, but he couldn't reach them. The 17 planes were drifting into the North Sea, and he was powerless to stop it. He looked around the cramped, dusty shack. The old equipment, the vacuum tubes glowing orange, seemed to mock him. Too weak, Miller. Too weak. Wait. If the high-frequency interference was blocking his transmission, maybe he could use the interference itself. Frank remembered a field modification he had read about, a desperate measure used by Australian radio operators in the Pacific, where they would temporarily overload the antenna input with a specific pulse to burn through heavy atmospheric noise, essentially forcing a temporary, massive spike in power that would only last a fraction of a second, but might be enough to get through. It was dangerous. It could fry his entire system. He hesitated for a millisecond. If the equipment blew, the rest of the planes were definitely lost. But if he didn't try, The 17 planes he had just located were already lost. He reached for the control panel, bypassing the safety interlocks on the transmitter. He flipped the main power switch off, waited 3 seconds, and then slammed it back on, simultaneously hitting the transmit key and overdriving the input transformer with a quick, jarring pulse of current. The shack lights flickered violently. A sharp smell of ozone filled the air, and for a terrifying second, the main vacuum tube flared bright white. Crack, zzzt! It was a massive, uncontrolled burst of energy, a shockwave of radio power that punched through the static ceiling. Frank immediately pulled the power back to maximum safe operating level, praying the tubes hadn't melted. Then, through the static, a stunned voice cut through. "Homer 7, we heard that. What was that? 090 confirmed. We are turning." It was Bandit 88. The raw power surge had worked. He had punched a hole in the noise, just long enough for the message to get through. But he couldn't do that again. The equipment wouldn't survive it. Now that the formation knew he was still there, Frank had to maintain continuous, stable communication despite the interference. He realized he needed to change his strategy completely. Instead of relying on the pilots to find his signal, he had to use his directional finder to locate them and then use the least interfered frequency to transmit simple, vital instructions. He started working the dials like a concert pianist, constantly shifting the antenna array, chasing the scattered signals of the 17 aircraft. Bandit 62, move your frequency slightly higher, 126.8 megacycles, I can read you there. Heading 275. Bandit 95, shift down, 125.1. Your signal is clearer. Hold that bearing until I tell you otherwise. He was essentially running a personalized, decentralized air traffic control system, using dozens of unauthorized frequencies, giving individual attention to each plane, treating the vast, chaotic sky as a series of small, manageable problems. He was defying every single regulation in the book, but the planes were starting to turn back. Meanwhile, back at the main tower, Captain Hayes was in a state of controlled fury. He had tried calling the DF hut repeatedly. The line was dead. He had seen the brief, massive surge of unauthorized power that had nearly blown out the tower's receiving equipment. "Davies, get a runner down to the DF hut immediately. Sergeant Miller is completely non-responsive and running unauthorized power surges. He is jeopardizing the entire recovery operation. I want him relieved and brought back here now." Hayes barked, his face white with rage. Hayes believed Miller was either panicking and overloading the gear, or intentionally sabotaging the procedure. In his mind, the man was a dangerous liability. Frank, unaware of the approaching military police, the runner Hayes had sent, was fully immersed in the operation. He had managed to stabilize the remaining 17 planes into 3 distinct groups, all heading generally toward the base but still miles out and struggling. He was sweating profusely, the adrenaline burning through his fatigue. He had to keep talking, keep guiding, keep reassuring. "Bandit 88, you are the lead plane in your cluster. Tell your wingmen to follow your angle exactly. You are on the right track. You are the leader now. Do not look for the ground. Look for the bearing I'm giving you." He was using the lead pilots to relay instructions to the others in their immediate vicinity, essentially turning the pilots themselves into repeaters, bypassing the interference that was blocking his direct communication. It was a desperate, unconventional strategy, but it was working. The first cluster of 5 planes, led by Bandit 88, was now close enough that their engines were starting to sound louder, cutting faintly through the static. Frank knew the first 5 were safe, but as he prepared to guide them onto the final approach, the door to the DF hut burst, open with a loud kick. The young Corporal Davies, no relation to the lieutenant but the runner sent by Hayes, stood framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the dense fog, breathing heavily. He looked terrified. "Sergeant Miller, stop transmission immediately. You are under arrest. Captain Hayes ordered you to stand down. You are to report to the tower now," the corporal stammered, his hand reaching nervously toward the sidearm holstered on his hip. Frank didn't even turn his head. He kept, his eyes locked on the scope, his hand on the microphone. "Get out, Corporal," Frank said, his voice low and steady, radiating an authority that surprised even himself. "I am in the middle of guiding 5 planes through the fog. They are 2 minutes from touchdown. If you touch this equipment, you will be responsible for the deaths of 50 men. Now shut the door and stand by." The corporal froze. He saw the sweat dripping from Frank's face, the desperate glow of the vacuum tubes, and he heard the faint, panicked voices of the pilots crackling through the air. He was a young man, only 18, and the weight of 50 men stopped him cold. He lowered his hand from his pistol, closed the door softly, and leaned against the wall, watching the rogue sergeant work. Frank had bought himself a few more minutes. He focused on Bandit 8-8. 8-8, prepare for final approach. You are cleared to land. Bearing stable at 290. Maintain speed. You are home, son. A few seconds later, the massive roar of the B-17s passed over the shack, lower and louder than the first wave. The corporal gasped as the ground vibrated. 5 more planes down, 11 total. Frank took a quick, painful breath. He had 11 planes safely on the ground, but 12 were still out there. The third and most critical group. They were the furthest out, and their signals had been the weakest even before the storm hit. He checked the primary frequency. Still nothing but static. The interference had returned with a vengeance. "Homer 7 to any remaining bandit traffic, report your position. Report your position." Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. Frank slumped forward, resting his forehead momentarily on the cold metal of the radio set. He had defied command, risked court-martial, and guided 11 planes home. But the last 12, the deepest formation, were completely gone. He had lost contact, and he had no more tricks left to pull them back from the empty darkness. Night was closing in, and the fate of over 100 men hung on the faintest possibility that his too-weak signal had given them just enough hope to keep flying straight. He had to find them, and fast, before their fuel tanks ran dry, and they vanished forever. He slumped forward, resting his forehead momentarily on the cold metal of the radio set. He had 11 planes safely on the ground, but 12 were still out there, the third and most critical group. They were the furthest out, and their signals had been the weakest even before the storm hit. He had lost contact, and he had no more tricks left to pull them back from the empty darkness. Frank lifted his head, feeling the grit of exhaustion behind his eyes. He looked at Corporal Davies, who was still leaning against the door, wide-eyed and terrified, clutching his helmet. "Corporal," Frank's voice was hoarse, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you right now. Don't ask questions. Just move." The corporal straightened, up instantly, relieved to have an order, even if it was coming from a man who was technically under arrest. "Sir, yes, sir. The interference is too thick. My signal can't get through, and they can't hear me. But they are out there, running on fumes, and they need a beacon, something big and simple." Frank pointed toward the window, swallowed by the fog. "There's the maintenance hangar. Out back they have the old, tall emergency antenna, the one we use for ground-to-ground communication, during drills." Davies nodded, confused. That antenna was never used for air guidance. It was massive, meant for broadcasting across the entire base, but it was omnidirectional. No bearing data, just a loud noise. "It's not connected to the main tower, is it?" Frank asked. "No, Sergeant. It runs off its own generator. It's usually shut down at night." "Good. That means Hayes can't touch it. I need you to run to that hangar. I need you to power up that antenna, and I need you to broadcast a continuous sustained tone. Not Morse code. Just a long, loud beep. A sound so simple and powerful it will cut through this static like a knife." Davies' eyes widened. "Sergeant, that's strictly forbidden. That frequency is only for emergency ground evacuation. It will jam every non-essential line for 50 miles. Corporal, we are talking about 12 B-17s and over 100 men. That's a bigger emergency than any drill you've ever seen," Frank snapped, pointing at the dead scope. "I can't reach them, but if they hear that loud, simple tone, they will know where the base is. It will give them a direction to fly toward. Now go, And don't stop broadcasting until I tell you to." Davies didn't wait for a second confirmation. He threw open the door and vanished into the thick, wet fog, his footsteps pounding away toward the hangar. Frank was alone again, the silence pressing down on him. He knew what he was asking Davies to do was insane, a massive gamble. The loud tone would give the pilots a general direction, but it wouldn't tell them the precise angle to land. It would get them close, but without his DF guidance, they would still crash, either into the ground or into each other in the dense cloud layer. He had to find a way to make his too weak signal work with the new loud beacon. He listened intently, tuning his ANGRC-9 back to the primary frequency, ignoring the static. He waited. A minute later, a deep, resonant hum started up from the far side of the base, the sound of the old emergency generator kicking to life. Then, a second later, the atmosphere changed. Beep. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force, a deep, pervasive tone that vibrated through the floorboards of the DF hut. It was crude, aggressive, and entirely unauthorized. Frank put his headphones back on. The constant, loud beep was now dominating the airwaves, cutting through the heavy static. It was annoying, headache-inducing, but it was impossible to ignore. And then, through the sound of that massive, crude hum, Frank heard a change in the static pattern. It wasn't a voice. It was a ghost of a signal, a slight rhythmic wobble in the beep. The pilots were hearing the tone. They were tuning to it, and their transmitters, even the weak ones, were reacting to the immense power of the emergency broadcast. Frank seized the opportunity. He switched his DF equipment to a high-gain setting, making it hypersensitive. He wasn't tracking the bomber's weak signals anymore. He was tracking the distortion they created as they flew through the field of the giant new beacon. "I see you, you beautiful fools," Frank whispered, a fierce grin spreading across his face. The scope showed a faint, smeared cluster of readings. They were still scattered, but they were definitely moving toward the massive, loud hum. He grabbed the microphone, switching his output to the highest, most directional beam he could manage, hoping to punch through the noise with focused power. "Attention, all bandit aircraft following the continuous tone. This is Homer 7. I am back on the air. The loud tone is your guide, but I am your eyes. Listen for my voice over the noise. Do not deviate from the tone until I give you a precise bearing." A voice, shaky but relieved, cut through the din. "Homer 7, this is Bandit 37. We hear the tone. It's loud. Where are we?" "Bandit 37, you are the lead plane for the final 12, Frank stated, his voice now filled with renewed authority. "I need you to maintain your current heading. The tone is pulling you straight toward the field, but I need you to turn your directional finder slightly to the left, 270 degrees. That will put you exactly on the glide path." Frank was using the loud omnidirectional tone as a magnet, and his faint, precise signal as the needle of the compass. The pilots were trusting the sheer volume of the unauthorized beacon, but Frank was giving them the exact angle they needed to survive the fog. One by one, he worked them. It was a race against time, fuel gauges, and the rising sun. "Bandit 7 and 1, you are running too fast. Pull back on the throttle. You are going to overshoot. Follow the tone, but slow your approach." "Bandit 1 to 5, you are low. Pull up. Pull up. Your bearing is solid, but you are too low." The air in the shack was thick with ozone and sweat. Frank was leaning so close to the scope that the green glow reflected in his tired eyes. He was manipulating the old ANGRC-9 like a surgeon, coaxing the final 12 planes into a neat, disciplined line, all following the steady, deafening beep from the maintenance hangar. He heard the roar of the second cluster passing overhead, their engines sputtering slightly, a terrifying sound that meant they were running dangerously low on fuel. Vroom. Then the excited shouts over the radio. "Lights! We see the runway lights! Landing confirmed." 7 planes, down in that cluster. 19 total, only 5 left. The pressure was unbearable. Frank's hands were shaking. He could feel the exhaustion setting in, but he knew he couldn't stop until the last plane was down. Bandit 1 Nero, you are the last one. Your signal is fading again. I need you to trust me now. You are exactly 5 minutes out. Maintain 285 degrees. Look for the lights on the ground, not in the sky. They are right below you. There was a long, painful silence from Bandit 1-0. Frank held his breath. Had he lost them? Had the fuel finally run out? Then a faint, weak voice, thick with relief, cut through the static, sounding almost like a prayer. Homer 7, we see the ground. We are coming in. Thank you, Sergeant. Thank you. Frank didn't wait for the sound of the engine. He didn't need to. He knew that if the pilot saw the ground, he was safe. He slumped back in his chair, the adrenaline finally leaving him, replaced by a cold, bone-deep ache. He reached for the microphone to tell Corporal Davies to shut down the unauthorized beacon, but before he could speak, the door of the DF hut burst open again. This time, it wasn't a nervous corporal. Captain Hayes stood in the doorway, backed by 2 military police officers. Hayes was rigid with fury, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage, amplified by the faint, lingering smell of ozone and the deafening beep that was still vibrating the entire base. Sergeant Miller, you are relieved of duty. Immediately. You are under arrest for insubordination, unauthorized use of emergency frequencies, and blatant disregard of a direct order. Hayes's voice was a tight, dangerous hiss. Frank slowly pulled off his headphones, letting them drop onto the desk. The sudden silence after hours of static and shouting was deafening. He looked at Hayes, his eyes bloodshot and weary. All 23 planes are down, Captain, Frank said simply, pushing himself up from the chair. His legs felt like jelly. All 237 men are safe. They all landed within the established safety parameters, despite the fog and the interference. You can arrest me now, sir. Hayes paused. He had been prepared for denial, for argument, for a breakdown. He hadn't been prepared for that quiet, undeniable statement of fact. That is impossible, Miller, Hayes insisted, stepping into the shack. Your signal was marginal. You were running unauthorized power surges, and I just heard a massive, unauthorized broadcast on the emergency band. Yes, sir, Frank confirmed, nodding slowly. The signal was too weak, according to the numbers, so I had to make it stronger. And I had to use the emergency beacon to cut through the static so they could find the base, and then I used my too weak signal to give them the precise angle they needed to land. Hayes stared at the green scope, now mostly quiet, and then at the disconnected phone line dangling uselessly from the wall. He saw the sheer chaotic effort that had been expended in the small dusty shack. Just then, Corporal Davies stumbled back into the hut, sweating and panting, covered in fog dew. Sergeant Miller, I shut it down. The beacon is off. Did it work? Are they... Davies stopped dead when he saw Captain Hayes and the MPs. Hayes looked from the exhausted corporal to Frank. He knew instantly that this was not the act of a panicked or malicious man. This was the act of a desperate professional. Before Hayes could speak, a massive wave of sound rolled across the base. Not the noise of engines, but the sound of cheering. The ground crews, the fire teams, and the few early morning mechanics who had gathered near the runway had just seen the final B-17 Bandit 1 Nero roll safely off the main strip. They were counting the planes, 23 massive battered flying fortresses, all home. Hayes heard the cheers. He was a man of regulations, but even he couldn't ignore the sound of 200 men celebrating life. You disobeyed a direct order, Sergeant, Hayes said, his voice still firm but lacking the earlier venom. I saved 23 planes, Captain. The order to cease transmission would have killed them, Frank countered, meeting Hayes's gaze. The data said my signal was too weak. The results say it was strong enough. Hayes stood there for a long moment, the conflict raging across his face. The military system demanded discipline and adherence to metrics, but the reality of War demanded results, and Frank Miller had delivered the impossible. "You will write a full report on the technical modifications and unauthorized frequencies used tonight, Sergeant," Hayes finally ordered, his voice low. He gestured to the MPs. "The charges are dropped, but you are formally reprimanded for unauthorized use of emergency equipment and failure to comply with command instructions." Hayes didn't look at Frank again. He simply turned, his back stiff, and walked out of the DF hut, followed by the MPs. He knew the paperwork would be a nightmare, but he also knew that he couldn't court-martial a man who had just saved an entire squadron. Frank watched him go. He was reprimanded, but he was free. Corporal Davies let out a huge sigh of relief. "Sergeant, I thought we were both going to the brig." Frank just managed a tired smile. He walked over to the desk, picked up his headphones, and gently placed them back on the hook. The DF hut was quiet now, smelling faintly of burnt electrical components and the fresh, damp air of the morning fog, which was finally beginning to lift. He looked at the scope one last time. The green line was steady, waiting for the next signal, ready for the next crisis. Frank Miller, the radio man who sat in the quiet shack, had proven that night that the strength of a signal wasn't just measured in watts or decibels. It was measured in dedication, precision, and the courage to ignore the book when lives were on the line. The command said his signal was too weak. But that weak signal, backed by a man who refused to quit, had been the strongest thing in the entire sky, guiding 23 lost bombers and 237 men home to safety. He was just a radio man, but tonight Sergeant Frank Miller had been the lifeline.